What was it that attracted you to revolutionary politics?
What drew me to revolutionary politics was, I'd have to say, the sheer fact that they were revolutionary. That I could feel, I was born in 1949, so I was almost the perfect age to be at university in 1968, and to have become very outraged by a number of things, principally the Vietnam War, but not alone that. And to be very discontented, as many people were for different reasons, with the boring post-war, partly social democratic, partly conservative consensus. So, in a sense, the sheer promiscuity of the word revolution, I have to say, had some attraction to me. I think it's worth remembering that in 1968, at the height of what we thought of as, and I still do think of as, the appalling aggression accompanied by chemical destruction of its environment and people and other appalling things of Vietnam, in the United States, the Democrats were in power, in some ways quite liberal Democrats. In Great Britain, the Labour Party was in power. In what was then still Western federal Germany, there was a grand coalition of social democrats. In other words, if you wanted to oppose from the left, you had to go quite a long way to the left, because a sort of official left was already there. I think that context might be important, but it was more than anything else that actually, with what I think of still as a sense of history that I can sometimes call on, I actually felt one was entering a revolutionary period. I'll say quickly. The rejection by black America, often violent rejection, of its long condition of servitude. Very dramatic. The takeover in the middle of Mediterranean democratic Europe, Greece, with all its metaphors of democracy and so forth, by a right-wing military dictatorship protected by NATO. The war in Indochina. The way in which white Rhodesia was allowed to get away with a rebellion against the crown by what seemed to us a spineless regime. The extraordinary stirrings in Latin America, which had for long been a kind of backyard of American empire. A number of other things. And then, as the year rolled by and mounted, a social rebellion that nearly put an end to de Gaulle's Fifth Republic, which was long overdue to be put to sleep anyway. And in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, the very, very interesting stirrings, very intelligible to those of us who thought we were Trotskyists, who supported the left opposition tradition, of intellectual and working class opposition to Stalinism. So, one would hear speakers saying we might be living through another 1848 or even another 1917 or 18. And it didn't seem all that much of an exaggeration. So it took a long time. One had to live a while to realize that what I was actually seeing was the end of a long stretch of the European left.
Today, when people talk about revolution, what do you think the revolution is now? Or is there still one to be had?
I was asked to give a talk at the American University of Beirut a couple of years ago. In fact, you were there. About who are the revolutionaries in the Middle East now. And I had to do it in the teeth of some rather unappetizing audience members who are sympathizers of either Hezbollah or, more likely on that campus, the Syrian National Socialist Party, equally, not equally, but comparably disgusting group and so on. And also speaking against a kind of culture of anti-Americanism on that campus. Yeah. So to me, the revolutionaries in the Middle East now are the people who are trying to replace the Islamic Republic of Iran, putting their own lives right onto the street against a very ruthless regime, to transform a theocracy into something that's more appropriate to govern an ancient civilization like Persia, that's defamed and befouled by this clerical fascist regime. And the people who've striven with increasing success to create an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq, or an autonomous Kurdistan that might lead to stirrings, has already led to stirrings in Syria, Turkey, Iran, and elsewhere, among the oldest oppressed minority in the Middle East and the largest people in the world who don't have a state of their own. A cause much longer and in some ways more venerable than the Palestinian one. And I went on in that vein. Those are revolutionaries to me. And it's been, by extension, I would have said before then, the people who asked for so little in Eastern Europe up to 1989. It was revolutionary to demand something like a Bill of Rights modeled on the American Constitution. That was a revolutionary demand. And my conclusion roughly was, and is, if you want to shorthand it, that the American Revolution is probably, with its separation of powers, separation of church and state, guarantee of free expression, and other celebrated triumphs of the Enlightenment, is the only revolution, the model of which is still left.
When did you realize that the Soviet Union was irredeemable as a political force in the world?
I was born in 1949, and I grew up thinking of the Soviet Union as irredeemable. I mean, I had read Darkness at Noon, for example, Arthur Koestler's masterpiece novel about Stalin's show trials, on my own, and I'd been given 1984 to read. I would have read anyway in my school curriculum. And when I was 7, it's one of the first times I remember watching the news. In 1956, the two great international events were the doomed British invasion of Egypt with France and Israel, and the Hungarian Revolution and the repression by the Red Army of a popular revolt within a European capital city with tanks. You see it on the TV. So I was one of those fortunate people, I suppose, didn't have any illusions to lose in the Soviet Union, and you regarded it with plain horror as a ramshackle, corrupt, dangerous empire, but one that wouldn't last for very long. I never believed that it could survive its present. But that would be easy to do. I mean, any fool could do that who could read a book against Stalinism. But in experience as well as theory, I was in Cuba in 1968, in the run-up to the invasion of Czechoslovakia, as it then was. And I knew quite a number of the Czech student leaders and others who were trying to declare their own independence from the Warsaw Pact, from Russian domination of Eastern Europe, because the Russian Empire is slightly different from the Soviet Union, but coextensive with it. And I thought the Russians were going to invade. I didn't see what choice they'd have. They couldn't let it go. But nor did I think could they invade without completely, as if you like, losing their credit. That would be the end of it. And I took part in various arguments that took place in Cuba, in Havana, during that week in August, including Fidel Castro's endorsement. And then you could still meet people, reasonable people who were still members of the Communist Party in Western Europe. I knew quite a lot of them. Their whole expression changed from then on. It was as if their mainspring had broken. It often took them a long time actually to leave. But I can't remember anyone joining after that, for example. I just remember thinking, I've seen the end of it. I don't know how long it's going to take. It took 20 years, but it's over. That was, if you like, more demonstration than one needed for the situation.
But there's a part in your memoir where you talk about your experience with you pronounce his name wrong,
Leszek Kolakowski.
Where you disagree on whether or not communism can be reformed.
Yes.
And he was right in the end, wasn't he?
And wrong. Yeah, I was very fortunate when I was young to meet Leszek Kolakowski, national hero in Poland still. He died, I think now, only 2 years ago. Had been a so-called reform communist of the 50s generation. Had eventually been forced out of Poland by the repression in 1968, came to Oxford, where I then was. Wrote a magisterial history, not just of communism in practice, but of Marxism as a theory. It's still the best, most exhaustive critique of Marxist theory of history ever written. And Leszek, having been through these experiences, would tend to poo-poo any news of stirrings of reform or protest. And don't bring me any more news of reform communism, of hopeful shoots here and there. He said, it's an irredeemable system. It's beyond reform. Well, I thought that was true, but there still could be reform communists, which there were, of whom Mikhail Gorbachev was obviously the most salient example. And that precisely because it was beyond reform, even a fairly tentative attempt to reform it would do the job, would bring in the roof. So it's a nuance of a difference. But Leszek was too much unimpressed by developments like that by the end of his life. He was too wedded to pessimism. I hope I don't offend anyone watching who admired him as I did. Rudolf Barrow, for example, East German Marxist who went to jail after the invasion of Czechoslovakia and wrote a critique of the East German state, almost perfectly predicting the date on which it would collapse. when I showed Leszek this book, Barrow's book, in the late 70s, he said, basically, don't bother me with this. I mean, Barrow is still a Marxist. He can't have anything of interest to say on these questions. I was sure he was wrong, and I don't think I was wrong to point that out.